Hey guys, tonight we step into a world where the smell of fresh bread is not the comforting scent you imagine. Instead, you're standing in a dim Victorian bakehouse, air thick with flour dust that scratches at your throat and makes your lungs ache. The ovens roar hot enough to blister skin, and every loaf you pull from the fire hides a darker secret. Powders and chemicals slipped into the dough to keep it white, fluffy, and profitable. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least the bread looks nice in the shop window. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You rub your eyes and blink against the fog of flour hanging in the bakehouse. It clings to everything. The wooden beams, your hair, your eyelashes, so fine it feels almost soft against your skin until you realize you're breathing it in with every gasp. Bakers in Victorian England didn't just risk sore backs from kneading or burns from ovens. They lived inside what doctors later called a snowstorm of death. The fine dust seemed harmless, even playful when it sparkled in lamplight, but it crept deep into lungs, coating airways like plaster until breath came shallow and ragged. Doctors eventually named the condition baker's lung. You cough and it rattles in your chest, but no one stops working. There's too much dough to knead, too many customers waiting outside for their daily bread. Flour isn't just flour, though. By the mid-19th century, bakers often added alum, yes, the same stuff used in pickling, to make bread whiter and longer lasting. Whiter bread meant higher social status. Dark bread? That was for the poor. The irony, of course, was that the fancy bright loaves slowly poisoned the very people who could afford them. Historians still argue whether the average Victorian knew they were eating toxic loaves or whether they simply trusted that anything from a bakery must be safe. Your hands sink into the dough, sticky and heavy. Kneading is rhythmic, almost hypnotic, but you notice the powder burns when it mixes with sweat on your skin. Some bakers developed rashes and open sores just from long hours in contact with it. Picture eczema, but with the sting of salt rubbed in, day after day. And because health and safety regulations barely existed, you just shrugged, wiped your brow, and kept working. You can almost imagine a modern inspector fainting on the spot. Here's a quirky tidbit. Not all flour clouds came from honest wheat. Millers sometimes stretched flour with powdered beans, chalk, or even ground bones. Imagine biting into your morning toast and realizing you're basically chewing on a cemetery. There's actually a record of bakers trying to mask musty, spoiled flour by mixing in strong spices. Nutmeg toast? Lovely. Nutmeg toast covering up mold? Not so lovely. You shift your weight as the floor creaks under stacks of flour sacks. Each one is heavier than you expect, about 280 pounds in some cases. Bakers were expected to haul them on their backs, often up steep staircases to lofts above the shop. The flour slipped out with each jostle, filling the air until the very walls seemed to sweat with it. Some apprentices collapsed mid-delivery. Their reward? Usually a kick from the master and an order to keep moving. Your lungs burn now, and you know why. A Victorian medical journal once described autopsies of bakers whose lungs looked like concrete plastered within. It wasn't dramatic metaphor. It was literal flour hardened inside. You might imagine it's like breathing in powdered sugar at a carnival, except instead of sweet fun, you're slowly embalming yourself from the inside out. Historians still argue whether bakers themselves realized the danger, or whether it was considered just part of the job. Some workers may have noticed that older bakers rarely made it past middle age. But in a time when chimney sweeps coughed up soot and matchgirls glowed with phosphorus poisoning, flour dust barely registered on the scale of industrial misery, and then there's the eerie quiet of nighttime baking. Most Victorian bakeries worked in the dark hours, so bread was ready at dawn. You imagine the silence broken only by the scrape of paddles, the hiss of ovens, and the occasional barked order. The world outside still slept while bakers inhaled their nightly storm. There's something almost ghostly about that, like you're laboring in a secret world, one invisible to the customers who cheerfully buy their crusty loaf in the morning. Now, if you're wondering, yes, sometimes the flour dust literally ignited. Clouds of fine powder can explode if sparked, the same way grain silos sometimes go up today. Picture an apprentice striking a match for a lamp and suddenly, boom, the entire bakehouse rattles. It didn't happen every week, but it happened enough to make the newspapers. And of course, after sweeping up debris, they'd start kneading again, because what else could you do? There's a small comfort, though. You do smell bread baking. That rich, nutty aroma that makes you salivate and think of warmth, comfort, and home. Except now you know that every whiff hides a tangle of chemicals, lies, and slow suffocation. Sleep tight. You wake before the sun rises, already exhausted, and find yourself cutting into a steaming loaf of bread. It looks perfect, white, fluffy, and so light it almost melts in your hand. But the illusion is cruel. That whiteness doesn't come from some special grain, but from lead salts, alum, and even chalk, stirred in by desperate bakers trying to stretch profits. You don't need me to tell you that lead is not exactly a health food. Victorian England, though, had a different standard for what counted as edible. As you bite down, you taste a faint metallic tang. Maybe it's the butter knife. Maybe it's the bread itself. Historians still argue whether ordinary people actually recognized the strange taste and chose to ignore it, or if they had simply never known clean bread long enough to realize what they were missing. Either way, the stuff was on nearly every table, from factory workers to middle-class parlors. The logic was simple. Customers wanted loaves that looked pure and white, the kind you might show off in the window of your shop. Dark bread was linked to poverty. So bakers did what any profit-driven worker under pressure might do. They faked it. Alum, for instance, gave dough a softer, springier texture and made stale flour seem fresh. It was cheap, too. Imagine sprinkling laundry detergent into your muffin mix today. Same energy. And lead carbonate? Well, that was basically a baker's shortcut to make the bread look as pale as possible. Lead had been used in paint, makeup, and even wine sweeteners for centuries. People must have noticed that folks kept dying young, but society had a bad habit of shrugging at poison when it was fashionable. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some towns, bakers even used pipe clay. Yes, the same clay used for smoking pipes, to bulk out flour. So your breakfast could double as a small pottery experiment. You picture families slicing into the loaf, children reaching out for a slice. They chew happily, unaware their daily bread is laced with enough toxins to quietly wreck a nervous system. Lead poisoning often showed up as stomach cramps, headaches, or twitching muscles. Of course, no one made the connection between the bread basket and their mysterious illness. Doctors blamed miasmas in the air or personal weakness. You could literally be dying from your sandwich, but the official diagnosis was bad vibes. And let's not forget, bakers weren't the only culprits. Millers sometimes adulterated flour before it even reached the shop. Bakers, under pressure to compete with neighbors, passed along the problem rather than risk losing customers. It was like a toxic chain of command, only instead of emails, you had bread rolls stuffed with chalk. Historians still argue whether government inspectors turned a blind eye because they feared riots if bread suddenly became scarcer or more expensive. After all, when your whole city depends on bread, no politician wants to admit it's basically poison. You wipe sweat from your brow. Slice another loaf and picture yourself in the role of a baker's apprentice. The bread is ready, the shop smells divine, and yet you know you're selling something closer to medicine cabinet leftovers. There's a strange guilt in that, but hunger doesn't wait for conscience. Here's where it gets darkly funny. Bread was so central to Victorian diets that some families ate it for nearly every meal. Breakfast toast, lunch sandwiches, dinner with bread pudding, it was practically the skeleton key of food. Which means if your bread was toxic, your entire diet was too. Imagine a modern diet where everything, pizza crust, pancakes, cookies, is secretly cut with drywall dust. You'd be cranky, sick, and probably still buying more. Every so often, newspapers exposed a scandal. Journalists tested loaves and announced shocking results. Lead, alum, plaster, even powdered stone. Readers gasped, shook their heads, and then went out and bought bread anyway. What else could they do? You can almost hear the grocer muttering, "Sure, the bread may shorten your lifespan, but at least it looks respectable at tea." And then there's the eerie question of intent. Did bakers knowingly poison their customers, or were they just following the same shortcuts everyone else used without much thought? Historians still argue whether the majority were crooks or simply trapped in a system where survival depended on deception. Meanwhile, you take another bite, chew, and feel grit between your teeth. That's no sesame seed, it's sand. Sugar, flour, even milk was stretched with whatever the seller could sneak in. There's a documented case of London bread tested to contain alum so high that one chemist declared it was better suited for plastering walls than feeding children. Comforting thought, right? But you keep eating. The bread is warm, soft, and familiar. Your stomach growls, and survival always wins over suspicion. In the end, Victorian bread wasn't just food. It was a symbol. It looked like purity and prosperity, while hiding the slow creep of poison in every slice. You rub your eyes, squinting against the dark. The streets outside are silent, shutters drawn, and only the flicker of a few lamps marks signs of life. But you're already awake, tugging on an apron stiff with flour and sweat, stumbling toward the bakehouse before the clock even strikes midnight. That's the life of a Victorian baker. Your day begins when everyone else is halfway through dreaming. The air inside is cool at first, then suddenly heavy as the oven fires crackle to life. You shovel coal, sparks leaping like fireflies, while the room grows hotter by the minute. Your shoulders already ache, though the real work hasn't even started. Dough waits in massive troughs, each batch needing to be kneaded by hand. No electric mixers, no shortcuts, just your fists and forearms pounding for hours. You think about the 10,000 steps a day your fitness tracker nags you about. And you laugh. Victorian bakers burned through that before sunrise. By 2 in the morning, your body runs on autopilot. Knead, fold, stretch, repeat. Flour dust coats your skin, mixing with sweat until you feel like a dough sculpture yourself. A mug of lukewarm tea sits nearby, forgotten, while you tear and twist loaves with numb fingers. Here's the thing. Bakers worked nights, not out of personal choice, but because bread had to be ready for the early morning rush. Breakfast without bread was unthinkable, and customers wanted their loaves fresh. Historians still argue whether this nocturnal schedule was more punishing on the body or the mind, but either way, bakers shuffled through life in permanent jet lag. You hear a fellow apprentice yawn so loudly it echoes against the brick walls. Sleep wasn't just short, it was chopped into strange fragments. Many bakers napped in bursts, lying on flour sacks for a stolen hour before diving back to the ovens. Picture yourself trying to nap on a bag that weighs as much as a grown man, the seams scratching your face. Cozy, right? A quirky tidbit, some bakers were rumored to eat raw dough during the night shift just to stay awake. Imagine chewing on a gummy, sticky lump of yeast and flour at 3 in the morning. Energy drinks hadn't been invented, so raw dough was as good as caffeine, or at least that's what they hoped. Of course, that same dough sometimes kept fermenting in the stomach, which must have made for some very awkward burps. By 4 a.m., you're drenched in sweat, the room as humid as a sauna. The oven's raw, and you shovel loaves in with long paddles. Burns are inevitable. You can almost feel the singe on your forearm where hot bread brushed against skin. Apprentices wore their scars like badges, though they probably would have preferred actual sleep instead of permanent blisters. And then there's the smell. Oh, the smell. Warm, nutty, rich. It wraps around you, tempting and cruel at once. You're starving, but the bread isn't yours to eat. Stealing even a crust could get you fired or worse. You picture your modern self raiding the fridge at midnight for a snack, and suddenly it feels luxurious compared to this endless cycle of hunger and heat. The clock creeps toward dawn. Outside, the first wagons rattle on cobblestones, horses steaming in the chill air. Customers begin to stir, ready for their morning bread. You haven't seen the sun in hours, maybe days. It blurs together when you live by the bakehouse schedule. Imagine how your body must have felt, always working against its natural rhythm. Historians still argue whether the constant fatigue shortened lifespans or whether bakers simply adjusted to their nocturnal prison. And yet, you keep moving. More dough, more kneading, more loaves sliding into ovens. The monotony becomes almost hypnotic. If not for the heat, you might drift into sleep standing up. Apprentices sometimes did, leaning on the bench with hands still kneading, jerking awake when the dough slid to the floor. You almost admire the dedication, though maybe exhaustion is a better word. It's almost sunrise now. You wipe your brow, blinking at the streak of grey light seeping through the shutters. To the customers outside, the bakery will look cheerful, full of warmth and life. They'll smell the bread and smile, never imagining the ghostly hours that produced it. You, meanwhile, feel like you've lived an entire day before breakfast. And here's a dark joke for you. If insomnia ever bothers you, try imagining life as a Victorian baker. Either you'll fall asleep instantly from sympathy, or you'll be up all night out of solidarity. Either way, welcome to the club. You blink against the haze of heat, sweat dripping down your forehead as the ovens roar louder than a train engine. The bakehouse walls tremble with every shovel of coal you throw in, the air shimmering like molten glass. You press closer to the fire, sliding in another tray of dough, and for a second you wonder, what if this whole oven decided to explode? Spoiler, it sometimes did. Victorian ovens weren't sleek stainless steel appliances with neat timers. They were beasts of brick and iron, patched together with whatever the baker could afford. Coal fired them, and coal meant soot, sparks, and pockets of gas that occasionally built up enough pressure to blast out with a boom. Imagine standing in front of what's supposed to be a bread oven, and suddenly it's more like a cannon. Historians still argue whether explosions were a design flaw or simply the result of sloppy maintenance. But either way, being a baker sometimes meant dodging flying bricks along with kneading dough. You lean back, wiping your brow, only to notice cracks zigzagging up the chimney. Those chimneys weren't just ventilation, they were lifelines meant to funnel away the smoke. But Victorian chimneys collapsed more often than you'd hope. A loose brick here, a gust of wind there, and suddenly the bakehouse ceiling rained rubble. It wasn't uncommon for apprentices to be crushed or pinned, with neighbors rushing in to dig them out while loaves blackened in the flames. Here's a quirky tidbit. Newspapers occasionally ran stories about heroic bakers saving loaves instead of themselves during accidents. One tale describes a man pulling trays of buns from an oven even as smoke filled the room, coughing so hard he collapsed. Dedication or sheer stubbornness? Hard to tell. But you can almost hear his wife muttering later, "You risked your life for buns." The danger wasn't always dramatic explosions. Sometimes it was the invisible choke of carbon monoxide. You shovel coal, you sweat, you breathe, and then you realize your head feels foggy, your limbs heavy. You slump against the wall, eyelids drooping, until someone shakes you awake. In those moments, the bakehouse wasn't just a workplace. It was a trap. Today, we'd slap carbon monoxide detectors everywhere. Back then, you just hoped the dizziness passed before you face-planted into the dough trough, and yet, life went on. The ovens were unforgiving, but bread had to be baked. Customers never saw the scars on your arms from sudden flare-ups when fat dripped onto coals and sent fire licking outward. They never smelled the scorched hair when apprentices leaned too close. They only saw neat loaves stacked in baskets, golden crusts promising comfort. Historians still argue whether customers ever questioned the toll on bakers or if they were too focused on the bread itself. You hear a creak, louder this time. The chimney groans, shedding a sprinkle of dust into your hair. You hold your breath. Will it collapse tonight? Or will it wait until tomorrow when you've just started your shift again? Living with that kind of constant risk must have gnawed at bakers. Every fire stoked was both a livelihood and a gamble. To lighten the mood, imagine this. Somewhere in Victorian London, a baker probably whispered a quick prayer to the oven gods before striking his match. Maybe he promised not to burn the buns, maybe he begged for no explosions. And maybe, just maybe, he slipped in a cheeky thought. If it does blow up, at least let it take out the landlord first. The heat presses against your skin until you feel like dough yourself, rising and ready to burst. You fan yourself with a scrap of cardboard, but it barely helps. The room is an inferno, and you wonder how anyone survived it. The answer? Not everyone did. Records mention deaths by suffocation, collapse, burns. A bakery wasn't just a business. It was a battlefield with flour for smoke and ovens for weapons. And yet tomorrow, you'll be here again, coaxing fire from coals, sliding trays in, and hoping the oven doesn't decide to blow. Sleep comes later, if it comes at all. For now, you feed the beast. The first rays of dawn slip through soot-streaked windows as you wipe flour from your face. Outside, the streets are beginning to stir. Women with baskets on their arms, children rubbing their eyes, workers trudging toward the factories. But this morning feels different. You hear the rumble of voices, not cheerful chatter, but sharp, angry shouts. A ripple passes through the crowd, and suddenly you realize it's not just customers waiting for bread. It's a mob. Bread in Victorian England wasn't just food. It was survival. For many working-class families, half their income went straight into loaves. Raise the price by even a penny, and you might as well have stolen their week's wages. So when bakers or grain merchants adjusted prices, people rioted. These weren't gentle protests either. You can almost see fists pounding on bakery doors, windows shattering, loaves snatched from shelves before you can even shout. You stand behind the counter, heart racing as the crowd surges. Some want to pay less, others simply want bread at any cost. One woman waves a rolling pin like a weapon, shouting that her children will not starve while bakers get rich. Historians still argue whether bakers were truly to blame for high prices or whether government grain policies were the real culprit. But when you're the one holding the bread, you're the one the mob sees. The shutters rattle as stones hit the walls. Someone kicks the door so hard it cracks. You think about the irony. You spent all night coughing in flour dust, risking burns and collapses, and now the very people you bake for want to smash your livelihood to pieces. A quirky tidbit. Some towns had to post soldiers outside bakeries to keep order when shortages hit. Imagine a line of armed men guarding trays of crusty loaves. It's almost comical, if it weren't so desperate. You peek through the cracked door and see loaves being torn apart in the street. Chunks stuffed into mouths, crumbs trampled into mud. Bread is both treasure and tinderbox here. One loaf can feed a family or spark a riot that topples shop windows and sends bakers running for their lives. The smell of fresh bread mixes with smoke from torches, and for a moment you wonder if your bakehouse will be the next to burn. The fear wasn't always exaggerated. During some riots, bakers were dragged out and beaten, accused of hoarding or cheating. Others had their ovens smashed, businesses ruined overnight. Historians still argue whether these were organized rebellions or spontaneous eruptions of hunger. Either way, standing behind that counter, you'd feel the anger like heat from the oven itself, inescapable, overwhelming. You clutch a loaf in your hands, knuckles white. Part of you wants to hand it out, to calm the crowd. Another part remembers your master's voice. Never give away bread for free. But what is loyalty worth when faces outside twist with hunger and rage? Here's a grimly funny thought. If modern supermarkets operated like Victorian bakeries, one bad sale on sliced bread could have customers flipping shopping carts and storming the aisles. Picture a riot over gluten-free bagels. Ridiculous, but that's how fragile things once were. The noise grows louder. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you imagine what it must feel like to be one of those customers. Children crying at home, a belly gnawing with emptiness, wages drained. You might riot too, if bread meant the difference between life and death. A brick smashes through the window, glass scattering across the counter. You duck, heart pounding, and hear the master baker curse. But then, slowly, soldiers appear, their boots thudding on cobblestones, muskets slung over shoulders. The crowd hesitates, some scatter, others grumble, but the fury begins to fade. The soldiers stand silent, a wall of steel between bakers and the hungry mob. You exhale, shoulders sagging. Another riot survived. Tomorrow, you'll stoke ovens again, knead until your arms ache, breathe in dust, and sell bread to the very people who nearly tore your shop apart today. That's the cycle. Bake, sell, fear, repeat. Your stomach growls as you eye the sugar jar on the shelf, but don't get too excited. That sparkling sweetness isn't the pure cane crystal kind you're picturing. In Victorian England, sugar was often cut with cheaper fillers, sand, powdered glass, or even ground bones. You dip a finger in and taste grit crunching against your teeth, like chewing on a beach. Sweet, yes, but with a side of dental disaster. Bread wasn't the only problem. Pastries and sweets, the treats you dream about when trudging through the night shift, were sometimes bulked out with chalk or plaster. Imagine biting into a cream puff and realizing it's more chalkboard than dessert. A quirky tidbit, some bakers also used red lead to color sweets, a tempting shade of pink. Yes, red lead. If you ever wondered why Victorian children didn't live long enough to develop cavities, there's your answer. You picture a bakery window lined with sticky buns, tarts, and sugar-dusted donuts. They look irresistible under the morning sun, but each one carries a silent gamble. Is that sugar actually sugar? Or did the grocer sweep sand from the floor into the barrel? Historians still argue whether shopkeepers knowingly passed along adulterated sugar or whether they were victims themselves, buying bad stock from wholesalers. Either way, the end result was the same. A population slowly chewing on rocks disguised as sweets. You crack a pastry with your teeth and feel chalk squeak between molars. The taste is faintly metallic, maybe from the tin glaze brushed across the crust. Bakers sometimes polished pastries with substances better suited for furniture than food. Why? Because shiny pies sold better. You can almost hear the sales pitch. Yes, ma'am, this tart glimmers like polished oak, perfect for Sunday tea. And the customers bought it. They bought it because sweetness was luxury. Sugar meant wealth, celebration, a break from the grind of everyday hunger. So even if the sugar felt gritty or the pastry tasted suspiciously like limestone, most people shrugged. Better to chew plaster than have nothing sweet at all. You think about the contrast. The poor gnawed at adulterated bread. The wealthy indulged in adulterated pastries. And both ended up poisoned in different shades of sugar. No one escaped. And the irony? Britain was one of the largest sugar importers in the world at the time. There was real sugar in the system, but greed and cutting corners meant it rarely reached ordinary mouths without being stretched. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. In some places, honey was sold as a safer alternative. But guess what? That too was faked, often diluted with treacle or dyed syrup. If you bought honey, chances are you were eating boiled starch tinted with saffron. So much for nature's sweet gift. You set the pastry down, brushing crumbs from your hands, but the grit lingers. It makes you wonder if your own teeth will last long in this world of sugar scams. Dentists were rare, expensive, and terrifying. Imagine walking into one with chalk-clogged molars. Probably easier to just keep chewing until they crumble. Historians still argue whether the government deliberately ignored these practices because prosecuting bakers and grocers would destabilize the food supply. Some suggest officials saw a little chalk as a small price to pay for keeping loaves and tarts affordable. Others claim the inspectors were simply bribed to look away. Meanwhile, you can't help but laugh at the thought of modern food labels slapped onto Victorian goods. May contain traces of bones, chalk, or mild explosives. At least then, people would have had a choice. The ovens hiss behind you, another batch of bread rising. The sugar jar sits innocent on the shelf, sparkling like treasure. You know better, but part of you still wants a taste, because even poison, when wrapped in sweetness, is hard to resist. You cough into your sleeve, the sound muffled but raw, as if your lungs are lined with sandpaper. The bakehouse smells of warm bread and coal, but every breath you take feels heavier, harder. This isn't just fatigue from a long night. This is the infamous baker's lung. It sneaks up slowly. At first, it's just a tickle, a little wheeze you brush off. But day after day, breathing in flour dust so fine it drifts like snow, your lungs become storage bins for powder. You imagine plaster hardening inside your chest, sealing off airways bit by bit. By the time you realize the damage, it's too late. You're coughing up white paste, your chest rattling like a broken bellows. Doctors of the era recognized the problem but didn't have solutions. They called it asthma of the bakehouse, or Miller's disease. The advice: step outside for fresh air. Easy to say when your entire livelihood depends on staying inside. Historians still argue whether bakers truly understood the long-term risks, or whether they chalked up every cough to just another day at the ovens. You press a hand against your ribs, feeling the vibration of each cough. Apprentices sometimes grew so breathless they fainted mid-shift, slumping onto flour sacks. Some never woke up again. Imagine being discovered at dawn, pale and still, while loaves cooled around you. It's the kind of tragedy the customers never saw when they bit into their breakfast toast. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some bakers tried wearing makeshift masks, handkerchiefs tied around their mouths to filter the dust. But in the heat of the bakehouse, those cloths soaked with sweat in minutes. One sneeze and the mask became useless. Others swore by drinking ale to clear the lungs, which probably just made them tipsy enough to forget how badly they were wheezing. You lean against the bench, staring at a thin shaft of sunlight cutting through the floury haze. The particles glitter like tiny diamonds, beautiful until you remember they're suffocating you. You picture a modern yoga studio bragging about its air purifiers and laugh. Victorian bakers would have given anything for even a cracked open window. The irony is cruel. Bread was life, yet baking it slowly killed those who made it. Families depended on bakers, but the very act of kneading, tossing, and shoveling condemned workers to shorter lives. Historians still argue whether these health risks helped spark the first labor reforms, or whether bakers' suffering was simply accepted as the cost of feeding a growing empire. You cough again, a deep, hollow sound that leaves you dizzy. The master baker barely glances up. He's heard it all before. To him, it's just background noise, like the crack of coal or the hiss of steam. But you can't shake the dread. What if this is the cough that never goes away? And here's a grim little joke. If you ever wanted to be immortalized in Victorian times, just cough dramatically in a bakery. People might assume you're rehearsing for an opera. Either that, or they'll tell you to stop contaminating the dough. The loaves finish baking, their golden crusts glowing like treasure. Customers outside line up eagerly, never questioning the hidden price paid in lungfuls of dust. You set them out with trembling hands, chest still tight, wondering how many more dawns you can endure before your breath gives out entirely. You step outside for a breath of air, coughing less now, but still rattled. The street is quieter than the bakehouse, but your attention drifts next door, to the small cottage with a garden that seems to spill over with green. Herbs climb wooden stakes, flowers nod in the breeze, and a faint smell of rosemary and thyme wafts toward you. Idyllic, right? Except in the Middle Ages, that neighbor would have been in trouble. Big trouble. You glance at the woman tending the garden. She's bent over a row of plants, her hands stained with soil, muttering softly to herself. To you, it's harmless. Just someone enjoying her garden. But back then, this picture looked suspicious. Herbal knowledge could heal a headache, soothe the stomach, or stop bleeding after childbirth. Yet those same skills made people whisper, witch. Historians still argue whether accusations were more about genuine superstition or just jealousy and fear of independent women. Imagine it. You knock on her door, asking for help with a toothache, and she offers a poultice of sage. Relief comes, but so does suspicion. How did she know that? Neighbors whisper.
Why does her garden grow so well when ours wither?
Before long, healing herbs look like instruments of sorcery. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some women deliberately planted their gardens in moonlit patches, believing the lunar cycles made herbs more potent. Whether true or not, it only added fuel to gossip. If your neighbor is gathering plants at midnight, carrying a bundle under her arm, it doesn't take long before someone mutters about broomsticks. You lean on the fence, watching her snip lavender. The smell is calming, but in another era, it might be terrifying. Lavender was linked to love charms, mint to protection, rue to ward off evil. Owning too many herbs, ironically, marked you as too knowledgeable. And knowledge, especially in the hands of women, was dangerous. You imagine the scene. A group of villagers marching up, demanding answers. Why does your garden thrive while our fields rot? She's asked. She shrugs, explains the soil, the watering, the care. But reason never mattered much in witch trials. Historians still argue whether these accusations were truly about fear of the devil or simply convenient excuses to punish outsiders, widows, or anyone who seemed a little too different. The saddest part? These herbalists were often the only source of medical help in poor villages. They eased childbirth pains, healed fevers, and treated wounds when no doctor was within miles. But if a patient died, as patients often did in those days, the healer became the villain. Imagine being blamed for death when you were the only one who tried to help. You look back at the garden now, the leaves fluttering in a soft breeze. It seems harmless, even beautiful. But to medieval eyes, it was a suspicious little jungle of sorcery. If you needed help, you'd whisper to the herbalist at night, praying no one saw you slip through her door. If you didn't need help, you'd mutter that her rosemary smelled too strong, her garden too green, her hands too skilled. And here's your joke for the night. In today's world, people pay a fortune for organic herb gardens. Back then, the same setup got you accused of witchcraft. Imagine telling a modern influencer their backyard sage would have landed them at the stake. The woman next door hums as she gathers another bundle. You hear children's laughter inside her cottage. To you, it's a scene of peace. But history reminds you, peace was fragile. One unlucky harvest, one unexplained illness. And that neighbor's garden might transform from sanctuary to evidence. You glance down at your hands, the flower still clinging to your skin, and you notice something odd. You've been kneading dough with your left hand more than your right. Today, that's no big deal. Maybe you're just left-handed. But in the Middle Ages? Congratulations, you'd probably already be branded a witch. Being left-handed was seen as unnatural, a sign that you weren't quite right with God. The very word sinister comes from the Latin for left. Imagine trying to write a grocery list, and your neighbors decide your handwriting proves you're in league with the devil. Historians still argue whether this stigma came more from superstition or from the practical awkwardness of left-handers messing up neat lines of script in monasteries. Either way, if you picked up a quill with the wrong hand, you risked more than just smudged ink, you risked suspicion. Picture yourself at a village gathering. A priest calls on everyone to make the sign of the cross. You instinctively lift your left hand. Gasps ripple through the crowd. She defies God. Someone whispers. Suddenly, a simple reflex is transformed into evidence. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some parents in medieval Europe tied children's left hands behind their backs to force them into using the right. The logic? Better a sore shoulder than a reputation for devilry. Imagine being a kid, trying to eat stew with your non-dominant hand, while everyone glares at you like you're hexing the spoon. And it wasn't just writing or eating. Playing instruments, sewing, even stirring a pot the wrong way could attract suspicion. Your left hand became a kind of scarlet letter, visible every time you picked something up. Historians still argue whether left-handers truly faced widespread persecution or if the most extreme cases were exaggerated by later storytellers. Still, enough records survive to suggest the fear was real. You flex your fingers now, feeling the muscles ache after a long night of kneading. Imagine living in a world where something as simple as your dominant hand determined whether you were seen as normal or cursed. No crime, no spells, just biology turned into superstition, and here's a sleepy little joke to soften the blow. If you're left-handed listening to this right now, don't worry, you're safe. Worst case, someone accuses you of being creatively cursed, which honestly sounds more like a compliment. You shake out your wrist, dust spiraling into the air like pale smoke. Back in the Middle Ages, that gesture alone might have made neighbors uneasy. Left hand raised, flour like ghostly powder. Proof enough, in their minds, that you weren't just baking bread. You were conjuring something far stranger. The dawn light slants across the street, catching on a black cat that darts between barrels. Its eyes gleam gold, unbothered by the noise of carts and clattering hooves. You watch it weave gracefully, tail flicking like a whip. In our time, you'd probably snap a photo and call it cute. In the Middle Ages, you'd already be nervously crossing yourself. Black cats were tangled up in centuries of superstition. They weren't just unlucky. They were thought to be companions, or even disguises, of witches. Picture the village gossip. I saw her cat vanish into the night, and then she appeared in the same spot moments later. Logical? Not really. But when people already feared the unknown, a shadowy animal prowling at dusk was all the evidence they needed. Historians still argue whether this association was rooted more in pagan traditions, where cats were sacred, or in the church's need to demonize anything tied to older beliefs. You crouch to watch the cat, its paws silent on the cobblestones. To medieval eyes, that quietness looked unnatural. A dog barks, a horse neighs. But a cat? It glides without a sound, slipping into darkness like smoke. Too stealthy, too secretive. Add in glowing eyes that reflect firelight, and you have a ready-made symbol of sorcery. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, sailors actually treasured black cats, believing they brought good luck on ships. So while landlocked villagers burned them, mariners begged for them. Imagine explaining that contradiction. On land you're evil, but at sea you're basically a furry good luck charm. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, sailors actually treasured black cats, believing they brought good luck on ships. So while landlocked villagers burned them, mariners begged for them. Imagine explaining that contradiction. On land you're evil, but at sea you're basically a furry good luck charm. You reach a hand toward the cat, but it skitters away, tail flicking like a final insult. In the Middle Ages, that little rejection might have been taken as a sign. See? The beast knows she's guilty. Suddenly, you're not just the neighbor who feeds strays, you're someone consorting with familiars. The cruel irony. Black cats were hunted so viciously during certain periods that rat populations exploded, worsening outbreaks of plague. Historians still argue whether the persecution of cats directly fueled the Black Death, but the timing is suspicious. Kill off the animals that eat disease-carrying vermin, and bad things happen. Medieval logic at its finest. You imagine yourself in that world, standing by your door as villagers whisper. A cat on your windowsill becomes a curse. A meow at midnight becomes evidence. No matter how many times you say, it's just a pet, the fear clings like smoke. And here's your sleepy chuckle. If cats really were witches in disguise, then half the internet today would be under magical control. Which honestly might explain TikTok. The cat disappears around the corner, leaving you with an odd emptiness. You breathe out slowly, watching flour dust settle on your sleeves, wondering how something as ordinary as a stray animal once carried the weight of life or death. Your stomach growls, reminding you that a baker's life is filled with bread, but not always with meals. You reach for a heel of yesterday's loaf, chew it slowly, and think about another danger that's not just about lungs or gossip. It's hiding right in the flour itself. Grain in the Middle Ages wasn't clean. Stored in damp barns, infested with rodents or tainted by molds, it carried risks beyond simple spoilage. One fungus in particular, ergot, thrived on rye, turning dark kernels into twisted, horn-like shapes. Eat bread made from that, and you weren't just full. You were hallucinating, convulsing, sometimes even dying. People called it St. Anthony's fire because sufferers' limbs burned with pain, and in severe cases, their fingers or toes literally rotted away. You picture villagers clutching their hands, screaming as though flames licked from within, all from a loaf of bread. Historians still argue whether outbreaks of ergot poisoning explain some witchcraft panics. Imagine half a town eating bad bread, then stumbling around with visions, spasms, and delirium. To frightened neighbors, that looked like possession or sorcery. It's unsettling to think that the same mold you scrape off cheese today might once have fueled mass hysteria. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars suggest that ergot poisoning could have contributed to the strange behavior during the Salem witch trials centuries later. Was it witches or was it just rye gone wrong? The debate continues, a reminder that sometimes the scariest demons are microscopic. You chew your bread more cautiously now, as if you might detect a spark of poison in each bite. The crust tastes normal, but your imagination lingers on the possibility. One wrong shipment of rye, one careless miller, and your whole village could descend into chaos. The master baker once told a story of a family that insisted their child was bewitched because she thrashed in her sleep, limbs flailing. Later, someone whispered she'd eaten rye bread from a batch that looked a little off. But by then, the gossip had spread faster than the truth. And here's a gentle joke to lighten the dread. If anyone ever accuses you of witchcraft today, just hand them a slice of gluten-free bread. They'll be too confused to continue. You finish the crust, brushing crumbs from your apron. The air feels heavier, as though even the food you bake, the very thing meant to sustain life, hides shadows of death and madness. In the Middle Ages, bread wasn't just daily sustenance, it was a gamble. Each bite carried the possibility of nourishment. Or nightmare. You wipe your hands on your apron, glance at the dim light creeping through the shutters, and imagine yourself not here in the Victorian bakehouse, but in a medieval village square. A crowd gathers, their faces tight with suspicion. Why? Because you're humming while kneading, or maybe you've been spotted walking alone at night. In those centuries, almost anything out of the ordinary could get you accused of witchcraft. The rules weren't written down in any neat manual. Instead, they grew from gossip, fear, and the kind of logic that only makes sense when people are desperate for someone to blame. Did a cow stop producing milk? Clearly the neighbor who looked at it funny is at fault. Did a child fall ill suddenly? Must be the widow who muttered under her breath. Historians still argue whether these accusations were genuine fears or more often weapons to settle grudges, seize property or control difficult people. You imagine the moment someone points at you, voice rising over the crowd. She's a witch! It doesn't matter what you've done or not done. The accusation itself is like a spark in dry straw. Neighbors join in, stories twist, and suddenly your life is no longer yours to control. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, even having too many cats or too few friends could land you on the wrong side of suspicion. It wasn't about evidence, really. It was about fitting, or failing to fit, into the puzzle of village life. Anyone who stood out became a convenient target. Your mind drifts back to your own quirks, maybe the way you write with your left hand, or how you like to stay up late baking. Back then, those habits alone could be damning. People didn't need proof. They needed someone to point to when the harvest failed, or a storm destroyed crops. And here's your sleepy little joke. In modern times, if you told someone you could predict the weather by looking at clouds, they'd probably call you a meteorologist. In the Middle Ages, they'd light a bonfire in your honor, and not the good kind. You picture yourself on the edge of the crowd, accused and confused, watching friends avert their eyes. There's no way to defend yourself because the rules shift with every rumor. If you cry, it's guilt. If you stay calm, it's proof you've hardened your soul. Either way, suspicion sticks like tar. The bread oven hums in the background, pulling you back to the present. You realize the dangers of a baker's life. Dusty lungs, spoiled flour, were only one layer of risk. Another layer came from the simple, unpredictable cruelty of human suspicion. The village square echoes in your imagination, but instead of shouts, now you hear splashes. You're standing at the edge of a murky pond, the surface rippling with reeds and the occasional dart of a frog. Someone tugs your arm, accusers ready to prove whether you're guilty of witchcraft. They don't have evidence, but they have a test. Water itself will decide. Trial by water, they call it. The idea is simple, if grim. You're bound hand and foot, sometimes with a rope tied around your waist for retrieval. Then you're thrown into the water. If you sink, congratulations, you're innocent. Though you might drown before anyone bothers pulling you back up. If you float, clearly the water has rejected you and you're branded guilty. Historians still argue whether communities truly believed water was a divine judge, or if the ritual was more about publicly humiliating and controlling the accused. You imagine the cold shock as you plunge in, lungs seizing, clothes dragging you down. The villagers lean forward, eyes sharp. A bubble escapes your lips. You want to sink quickly, prove innocence, but your body fights instinctively, thrashing for air. And the cruel irony? Struggling makes you float more, damning you in their eyes. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, the rope tied to the accused was deliberately short. So retrieval, after sinking, didn't always happen in time. Innocent, guilty. It hardly mattered. Survival was rare. You picture the scene from above, a body bobbing, gasping, villagers murmuring, priests nodding solemnly. Maybe a few neighbors smirk, settling old grudges. Others glance away, uncomfortable but silent. It's theater, really. Grim entertainment under the guise of justice. And here's your sleepy chuckle. By medieval logic, professional swimmers today would be instantly convicted. Float too well, and clearly you've signed a contract with the devil. The water in your mind still ripples as you shake yourself back to the warmth of the bakehouse. A cough rattles in your chest, but even that feels safer than the thought of being tied, judged, and tossed like cargo. You wipe sweat from your brow, thinking how relief and danger often lived side by side in history, whether in a loaf of bread or a pond of water. You rub your arms as though shaking off the phantom chill of that pond. But another kind of chill creeps in, this time from the sound of scratching quills and the smell of old parchment. Picture a medieval scribe, hunched over a wooden desk in a monastery, carefully copying Latin texts by candlelight. Writing was sacred, powerful, and reserved for the learned few. If you, a commoner, especially a woman, were seen scratching letters into parchment or even carving strange symbols on a doorframe, suspicion would flare instantly. Literacy wasn't just rare, it was unsettling. Words carried weight, almost magical in themselves. The Bible, after all, was the book of books, and if someone outside the church seemed to command letters, people wondered where that power came from. Historians still argue whether accusations tied to writing were more about superstition or about guarding the monopoly of knowledge held by clergy and officials. You glance down at your flour-stained fingers, imagining them ink-stained instead. Even doodling could look dangerous. Draw a star? Suddenly it's a pentagram. Mark a tally on your door? Clearly you're cursing your neighbors. In an age where illiteracy was the norm, every mark looked like a spell. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some accused witches were said to have books of secrets, often nothing more than herbal notes, recipes, or even family records. To the fearful, though, those scribbles became grimoires. A grandmother's soup recipe could transform into a page of sorcery if found at the wrong time. You picture yourself, pen in hand, writing out your name. Villagers gather, whispering. She commands the hidden signs. The irony, of course, is rich. What we see today as education, they saw as diabolical. And here's your sleepy chuckle. By medieval standards, anyone with a Twitter account would have been burned at the stake long ago for summoning words into the ether. The bakehouse creaks as you set down your imaginary quill and return to kneading. Your floury fingerprints smear the wooden bench, harmless smudges that no one here would question. But in another time, in another place, those very marks might have been read as curses or contracts, evidence enough to brand you a witch. You stretch your back, rolling your shoulders, and imagine another scene, this time not with parchment or ponds, but with nothing at all. No tools, no herbs, no black cat nearby. Just you, standing in a field at dusk, staring at the sky a little too long. In the Middle Ages, that alone could be enough. Why? Because superstition had a way of sticking to even the simplest quirks of behavior. Maybe you're seen muttering under your breath while you walk home. In truth, you're reciting a bread recipe, counting handfuls of flour in your head. But to the suspicious neighbor trailing behind, you're chanting. Or perhaps you enjoy wandering alone in the woods, collecting mushrooms for dinner. Suddenly, your solitude looks like secret meetings with spirits. Historians still argue whether these suspicions were genuine fear or convenient excuses to control people who didn't conform to village life. The frightening part is how flimsy the evidence needed to be. Cows die? A storm hits? Someone saw you smile at the wrong moment? Proof enough. Witchcraft accusations weren't about catching the guilty. They were about calming the fearful. A scapegoat always made the world feel safer, even if it didn't solve the real problem. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some villages, even a sneeze at the wrong time could turn into suspicion. Sneezing was often thought to expose the soul, so if you sneezed and someone got sick soon after, well, obviously you'd curse them through the air. Bless you indeed. You picture yourself standing silently in the middle of a suspicious crowd. If you defend yourself too passionately, you sound desperate. If you shrug it off, you sound cold. It's a no-win situation. And here's your sleepy little joke. If medieval villagers had access to modern lie detectors, the needles would have gone haywire just from everyone panicking at once. You let out a slow breath, glancing at the loaves cooling nearby. At least bread has clear rules: flour, water, yeast, heat. It doesn't turn against you because you sneezed or stared at clouds. But superstition? That was the true unpredictable ingredient in daily life, ready to rise at any moment. The oven hisses softly as you slide out another tray of loaves, their crusts crackling in the heat. You set them aside and think about another way suspicion crept into lives, not just through quirks or habits, but through the body itself. Imagine waking up with red blotches across your arms or a strange swelling on your neck. To modern eyes, it's a rash, maybe an allergy. In the Middle Ages, it was a billboard screaming unnatural. Physical marks mattered. Birthmarks, scars, warts. These were all read as signs. People believed the devil left them on his followers, little stamps of ownership. Accusers searched skin obsessively, prodding and pinching. If they found a patch that didn't bleed when pricked, that was proof. Historians still argue whether this obsession came from genuine belief or from a convenient way to justify suspicions already decided. You run your hand over your own arm, imagining the sting of someone poking at you with a needle. They crowd around, murmuring, eager for confirmation. One birthmark shaped vaguely like a crescent moon. Guilty. A scar that never healed quite right? Evidence. Suddenly, the private landscape of your skin becomes public property, scrutinized by fearful eyes. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some trials, officials shaved the accused completely, head to toe, just to make sure no hidden witches' marks escaped notice. Imagine the humiliation of standing bare before your neighbors, your every freckle or mole treated like a criminal confession. And the worst irony. These marks were natural, often genetic, sometimes caused by malnutrition or disease, things no one could control. Yet superstition spun them into sinister contracts. Historians still argue whether these examinations were sincere or simply theater to reassure crowds that justice had been done. You picture yourself kneeling on cold stones, a crowd watching as hands tug at your sleeve, searching. No matter what they find or don't find, the verdict has already been written in their eyes. And here's your soft, sleepy laugh. If medieval villagers lived today, they'd think half the population was signed up with the devil, what with tattoos, piercings, and acne all glowing like neon witch marks. You rub your chest where the cough from flour dust still lingers, and you're grateful that your marks are hidden inside, not visible on your skin. At least in this bakehouse, the only signs that matter are the golden ones, loaves rising and cracking just right. You lean back against the flour sacks, their weight pressing into your shoulders, and your thoughts drift toward the night sky. Imagine standing outside after a long day, gazing up at the stars. Today it's harmless, even romantic. But in the Middle Ages? Tilt your head back too often, and suddenly you're not stargazing, you're conjuring. Astrology blurred with astronomy back then. To some, the stars were God's map. To others, they were suspicious lights guiding the wrong sort of knowledge. If you knew too much about their movements, or even just predicted a storm by watching the sky, your neighbors might mutter that you'd bargained for forbidden wisdom. Historians still argue whether accusations in these cases were about fear of actual stargazing, or about mistrust of people who seemed too clever for their own good. You picture yourself explaining, "That bright star is Venus, shining low tonight." But instead of nods, you get narrowed eyes. How does she know that? Who told her? Suddenly, your harmless skywatching turns into evidence. The heavens, meant to inspire awe, become a trap. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval farmers really did plant crops by lunar cycles, believing certain phases encouraged growth. When harvests were good, it was divine blessing. When bad, suspicion fell on whoever had spoken too confidently about the moon. You can almost hear the villagers. The stars are hers. That's why our wheat failed. You rub your own eyes, heavy from flour dust, imagining that night sky swirling above you. It doesn't matter if you're just daydreaming. Suspicion reshapes reality. Someone catches you humming while pointing at Orion's belt, and next thing you know, they're whispering about spells cast on cattle. And here's a gentle laugh before sleepiness sets in. If medieval villagers saw modern folks checking daily horoscopes on their phones, they'd probably start sprinting for the nearest steak. She knows her rising sign. Devilry! You glance at the oven fire, glowing like a small star itself. Safer to keep your eyes on the flames, you think, than risk letting anyone catch you, marveling at the constellations above. In a world where even bread hides danger, the stars themselves could become evidence. The oven sighs as you pull another loaf free, steam rising like ghostly breath. You set it aside and rub your sore wrist. The ache lingers, reminding you of another danger. Not from flour or gossip this time, but from simple illness. Imagine lying in bed with a fever, cheeks flushed, your body trembling. In our world, people would bring soup and medicine. In the Middle Ages, they might bring accusations. Illness blurred into superstition. A sudden seizure, a fit of delirium, even a fainting spell, all could be read as signs of witchcraft. If you shook uncontrollably, neighbors whispered that you were channeling spirits. If you mumbled nonsense through fever, they thought you were speaking in tongues. Historians still argue whether epilepsy, in particular, was treated as a medical condition or as outright possession. The lines blurred depending on the century, the village, and the prejudice of the crowd. You imagine yourself in that bed, sweating through your clothes, your breath rattling. Someone leans over you, crosses themselves, and mutters, "She's cursed." Another insists it's not you, but the neighbor who cursed you. Either way, illness becomes evidence, not of biology, but of sorcery's invisible hand. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some cases, people thought a sudden recovery was just as suspicious as the sickness itself. If you bounced back too quickly, clearly you'd made a bargain. Heal slowly, you're cursed. Heal quickly, you're guilty. A no-win situation wrapped in superstition. You press a hand to your chest, remembering your own cough, the flour dust settling into your lungs. In another age, that wheeze might have been taken as proof of demons inside you. Today, it's occupational hazard. Then, it was diabolical residency. And here's your sleepy chuckle. If medieval villagers could see modern pharmacies with their rows of multicolored pills, they'd probably faint on the spot. Look, tiny sorcery stones, neatly labeled. You return to your workbench, the fever dream fading in your mind. The loaves crack softly as they cool, reminding you that sickness once wasn't just pain. It was suspicion. A sneeze, a seizure, a sigh too heavy, all could tip the scales between sympathy and a bonfire. Word count 162. Awaiting continue. You said continue, ChatGPT said. Section 19. You stretch your arms, listening to the quiet creak of your joints, and your thoughts slide to another layer of suspicion. Family ties. Imagine being born into a household where your mother, aunt, or grandmother was already whispered about in the village. That whisper clung to you like flour dust on an apron, impossible to shake off. Accusations often run in families. If one woman was labeled a witch, her daughters or nieces could be branded the same, guilty by association. Historians still argue whether this was driven by genuine superstition or by the practical ease of targeting entire households when neighbors wanted their land, livestock, or simply someone to blame. Either way, bloodlines could become curses. You picture yourself as a child, playing by the hearth when a neighbor storms in demanding answers. Did your mother teach you charms? You blink, confused, because the only charm you know is how she hums to calm you at night. But confusion doesn't matter. In their eyes, you've inherited not just her smile, but her supposed sorcery. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some records, children as young as 7 were questioned about witchcraft, pressed to confess that their mothers flew at night or whispered with spirits. Imagine the terror. Answering wrong meant betraying your family, but staying silent meant joining them in suspicion. The irony bites. Families were supposed to protect each other, yet here, kinship pulled you down together. Even marriage couldn't save you. Marry into a tainted family, and suddenly your own reputation carried that same dark stain. Historians still argue whether such accusations reflect fear of the supernatural or just a ruthless way of policing who belonged where in the social order. You picture yourself kneading dough beside a mother accused, the two of you moving in rhythm. Each push and fold feels like defiance against a world that sees your bond as sinister. And here's your sleepy chuckle. If medieval villagers lived today, they'd probably look at family group chats and say, "See? Secret covens, passing messages in glowing runes. You set another loaf to cool, the scent filling the bakehouse. Bread, after all, is shared, mother to child, family to family." Yet in the shadow of superstition, even that sharing became suspect. What should have been nourishment became one more thread in the tangled web of guilt by bloodline. The fire crackles softly, casting long shadows that flicker like restless figures against the bakehouse wall. You blink slowly and the shadows turn into another kind of stage. This time not gossiping neighbors or pointed fingers, but an official courtroom. Imagine being hauled before a tribunal, the smell of incense heavy in the air, the eyes of clerics or magistrates fixed on you. Here, suspicion hardened into spectacle. Interrogations weren't casual whispers anymore. They were rituals of authority. You were expected to confess, even if you had nothing to confess to. Historians still argue whether most people actually believed in the confessions extracted, or if the trials were more about reaffirming social order than uncovering truth. Either way, the accused rarely walked free. You sit in that mental courtroom, the bench hard under you, the murmurs of the crowd rising. Questions come fast. Do you renounce Satan? Who aided you in your spells? Each denial only raises more suspicion. The logic runs in circles, proclaim innocence too strongly, and they accuse you of lying. Speak softly, and they call it cunning. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some records note accused witches repeating their answers, word for word, sometimes dozens of times, as if clinging to the only defense they had. The scribes grew bored, the judges impatient. But to the accused, those repeated phrases were lifelines in a storm. You glance at your floury hands, imagining them shackled instead. The warmth of the oven replaced by the cold of stone walls. Even the questions themselves were traps. If asked whether you'd flown on a broom, saying no meant denial. Saying yes sealed your fate. Either way, the story was already written. And here's your soft chuckle. If medieval courts existed today, every confused Zoom call where someone says, "Can you repeat the question?" would probably be filed as a confession. The oven pops, snapping you back, but the echo of that tribunal lingers. It reminds you that accusation wasn't just about whispers in the square, it was about public theater. Rules stacked so heavily against you that no loaf of truth could rise under their weight. The oven's warmth clings to your skin as you shuffle flour across the bench. But your thoughts drift to another tool of suspicion, the ordeal. Imagine being led from the safety of your bakehouse to the edge of a pond, villagers circling like crows around spilled grain. Someone ties your wrists, their rope scratchy against your skin, and they tell you it's simple. Float, and you're guilty. Sink, and you're innocent, though you may not live long enough to enjoy that verdict. These ordeals were thought to reveal divine judgment. Water, seen as pure, supposedly rejected witches, making them bob to the surface like unwanted dough in a too shallow bowl. Historians still argue whether communities truly believed in the justice of such trials, or if they knew, deep down, it was theatre meant to satisfy their collective fear. Either way, the person in the pond rarely won. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some accounts, people were weighed against church Bibles. If you were lighter than the sacred texts, clearly you were unearthly, a witch. Heavy enough, and you were considered normal. You picture yourself standing on that balance, flour dust weighing down your clothes. Secretly grateful for the extra loaves you'd sampled during baking breaks, you rub your damp palms on your apron, imagining the chill of the water, the gasps of the crowd as you thrash. The absurdity bites: you could be accused of witchcraft for sneezing, then punished by drowning if you couldn't disprove it. A lose-lose recipe if there ever was one. And here's your sleepy chuckle. If those medieval villagers watched a modern swimming lesson, they'd probably faint. She floats, devilry. Fetch the ropes! The fire pops again, reminding you that your reality is safer, yet the echoes of those ordeals linger. They were community theatre at its darkest, where fear mixed with ritual, and truth was drowned long before the accused. The night stretches on, the ovens glow soft and steady, and you find yourself picturing another kind of trap. Confession under pressure. Imagine being locked in a chamber that smells of sweat and candle smoke, your body exhausted from sleepless nights, questions repeating like a chant. The goal isn't truth, it's surrender. Medieval interrogators often relied on relentless questioning, sometimes physical pain, sometimes just deprivation of rest or food. Eventually, people confessed to anything just to end it. Historians still argue whether these confessions were ever believed sincerely, or if authorities simply used them as paperwork to justify punishments they'd already decided on. Either way, the words written down rarely reflected reality. You picture yourself whispering, "Yes, I flew at night, though you've never left the ground except to trip over a sack of flour." The scribe's quill scratches as if your exhaustion were ink fueling his pen. Each word twists into evidence, each sigh becoming guilt. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some confessions included wildly impossible details. Witches claiming to ride goats backward through the sky or to dance with spirits inside walnut shells. Historians suspect these came either from leading questions or from desperate imaginations trying to satisfy interrogators. You can almost laugh imagining yourself wedged into a walnut shell, muttering, "Can I at least bring my rolling pin?" Your hands press into the dough, kneading rhythmically, grounding yourself against the thought of endless questioning. The bakehouse feels safer than that chamber, though your tired muscles ache in similar ways. You realize the line between labor and torment wasn't always so wide. And here's your sleepy chuckle. If medieval interrogators saw modern game shows where contestants are peppered with rapid-fire questions under bright lights, they'd probably nod approvingly. Yes, this is the method. The oven hisses faintly, reminding you that words once held the power to condemn, whether whispered in gossip or forced in confessions. Truth was irrelevant. What mattered was the story they could record, and how neatly it fit their fears. The loaves line the shelf like obedient soldiers, crusts crackling as they cool, and your thoughts wander toward the heaviest consequence of all, execution. Imagine the dread of hearing a sentence spoken aloud, not just whispered suspicions, but official words sealing your fate. The villagers who once traded bread with you now gather to watch your final act. Execution in witch trials varied by region. Some burned, some hanged, others faced more inventive punishments. Historians still argue whether these acts were more about purging supposed evil or about reinforcing community control through fear. Either way, the spectacle was public, meant to remind everyone what happened if you strayed too far from accepted norms. You picture the crowd's faces lit by firelight, their eyes reflecting both fascination and terror. They murmur prayers, or maybe gossip, as you stand bound. The irony isn't lost. You fed them bread, yet now they feast on fear. Your life turned into their evening entertainment. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, condemned witches were allowed to recite recipes for healing herbs or charms before death, as if their knowledge became valuable only at the moment it was about to be lost forever. You imagine yourself whispering the perfect recipe for sourdough starter, only to have it recorded as sorcerous incantation. You rub flour from your arms, thinking of how quickly the oven's warmth could mirror a pyre's heat. The tools of daily life, ropes, wood, fire, shift easily into tools of punishment. The line between sustenance and death feels fragile, thinner than parchment. And here's your weary chuckle. If medieval villagers saw modern barbecue grills, with flames licking under skewers, they'd probably shake their heads and mutter, "Ah!" Practicing executions in the backyard, the bread cools quietly, its crackle fading. And you realize that what terrified them wasn't just magic, it was difference. Execution wasn't about ending one life. It was about feeding the crowd's hunger for control, as loud and consuming as any fire. The night is deep now. The oven's glow softened to embers, and you find your mind wandering from fire and punishment to what came after. Imagine walking through a village where stories linger like smoke, long after the flames have died. Even if you survived accusations, your name might never recover. Reputation itself became a ghost that followed you. Once accused, always suspicious. Neighbors might avoid your bread, children might cross themselves when you passed, and every unlucky event, a dead cow, a spoiled harvest, could be laid at your door. Historians still argue whether these lingering suspicions were rooted in fear of the supernatural or in the practical politics of property, jealousy, and old grudges. Either way, the label clung like soot. You picture yourself trying to sell loaves at market, the smell of warm rye trailing behind you. Yet customers hesitate, whispering that your bread is bewitched. You could give it away for free, and still they'd stare at it as if it might sprout legs. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, survivors of accusations were forced to carry special signs or wear distinct clothing, marking them forever. It was like being branded a danger even after justice had supposedly cleared you. You imagine trudging through the square with a bright badge stitched on your apron, not Baker, but Bewitched. The oven snaps, pulling you back. You realize how exhausting it must have been to live under that shadow, never able to knead your way back to normal. Even silence could feel like evidence. Every quiet day, another chance for whispers to grow. And here's your sleepy chuckle. If medieval villagers saw modern credit scores, they'd probably say, "Ah, yes, your invisible reputation number." Truly a witch's curse. The bread cools on the rack, steady and dependable, but reputation never cooled so easily. In that world, you carried suspicion like an extra weight, heavier than any sack of flour, lingering long after trials ended and fires burned out. The embers glow low, shadows softening along the walls, and your thoughts finally turn to the long arc of it all, the survival of the stories. Imagine lying on your straw mattress after another weary day, the smell of flour still clinging to your skin, and wondering how people in the future will remember what you endured. Witch trials eventually faded, though not everywhere at once. In some regions, skepticism grew as scholars began questioning whether spectral evidence or confessions under duress could ever prove anything. Historians still argue whether this shift came from Enlightenment ideals, economic changes, or simply exhaustion after centuries of fear. Whatever the reason, the tide slowly turned. Yet the stories didn't die. They linger in folklore, in nursery rhymes, in whispered legends of women who baked herbs into bread or stirred potions in clay pots. Some of those tales became cautionary, others empowering. The image of the witch endured long after the tribunals ended, reshaped into fairy tales and eventually into Halloween costumes hanging in supermarket aisles. Here's a quirky tidbit, even centuries later. People dug up old records to clear names of the accused, issuing pardons to those long gone. It's like retroactive justice, far too late for the victims, but a strange attempt at healing communal guilt. You imagine a future historian reading your own trial notes and sighing, "Poor Baker, wrongly accused just for dusty hands." You smooth the last of the dough, realizing the irony that bread and witchcraft shared the same ingredients: fire, transformation, patience. To one, it was nourishment. To the other, damnation. Maybe it was always less about magic and more about how communities handled fear. And here's your final sleepy chuckle before the fade. If medieval villagers could see modern bread machines, with loaves rising on their own in glowing boxes, they'd probably scream, "Sorcery! Burn it!" The bakehouse falls quiet, the loaves cooling in the dark, and the stories settle too. Accusations, ordeals, and whispers all blur into history, a reminder that fear once turned everyday acts into crimes. You, lying here with heavy eyes, carry the knowledge of how fragile safety was, how quickly ordinary lives tipped into legend.